This is not a drill, this is not a prediction, and this is not a what-if scenario for the future. What I am telling you has already happened, and the consequences are rippling through every single household in America right now. If you pay taxes, if you own a small business, or if you simply walk into a grocery store and buy milk, you need to pay attention because your financial reality just changed. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court delivered a massive 6-3 ruling that sent shockwaves through the global economy. They didn't just tweak a minor rule, they effectively dropped a legal nuclear bomb on the administration's entire trade strategy. The highest court in the land officially informed President Donald Trump that his sweeping global tariffs, the very ones he spent the last year bragging about as his greatest economic achievement, were illegal, unconstitutional, and had to be terminated immediately. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to realize that these tariffs were the absolute centerpiece of the government's economic plan. For months, the administration has been acting as if the president had the sole power to tax anything coming into this country from anywhere in the world. But in a single afternoon, the Supreme Court took that power away and declared that the president had been overstepping his legal boundaries for a long time. They ruled that these massive taxes on imported goods were completely unauthorized by law. This means that for over a year, the government has been collecting billions of dollars from American businesses and consumers, based on a legal authority that the Supreme Court says never actually existed. It has turned the last year of American trade policy into a giant legal crime scene. The specific legal battle that brought us here was a case called Learning Resources Incorporated vs. Trump. This wasn't just one small company fighting the government. It was a massive consolidated effort that brought together hundreds of small businesses, major importers, and even several state governments. All of these groups stood up together and argued that the president had no legal right to do what he was doing. Specifically, they challenged his use of a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This law was originally designed to give the president power to deal with sudden, unusual foreign threats or national emergencies. However, the Trump administration tried to use it as a magic wand to slap giant tariffs on virtually every product coming into the United States from nearly every trading partner on the planet. The Supreme Court looked at the evidence and the history of that law and came to a very simple, very firm conclusion. The president was wrong. The majority opinion written by the justices made it crystal clear that the IEEPA does not give any president the authority to impose broad global tariffs just because they feel like it. They ruled that the power to tax and the power to regulate trade belongs to Congress, not the White House. The court's message was blunt, period, full stop, end of discussion. By using an emergency powers law to bypass Congress and tax the American people, the president violated the Constitution. This decision effectively means that every dollar collected under these IEEPA tariffs since they began was collected under false pretenses. The scale of this ruling cannot be overstated because it affects everything you buy. We are talking about thousands of categories of goods, from the shoes on your feet and the electronics in your pocket to the materials used to build your home. Because the court ruled these tariffs were illegal from the start, it has opened up a massive legal black hole. Businesses that were forced to pay these illegal taxes are now demanding their money back, and the total amount of money at stake is high enough to bankrupt many other government programs. This isn't just a political disagreement, it is a fundamental shift in how the American economy operates. The Supreme Court has officially pulled the rug out from under the administration, leaving the entire country to deal with the fallout of an economic policy that has now been branded as a total violation of the law. The moment the Supreme Court's decision reached the White House, the atmosphere shifted from routine business to total political explosion. President Trump was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with state governors when an aide handed him a note containing the news of the 6-3 ruling. According to witnesses who were in the room, the president didn't hesitate. He read the note, looked at the governors, and loudly declared the ruling a disgrace. Without finishing the meeting or offering further explanation to the state leaders, he stood up and walked out of the room. This wasn't just a brief moment of frustration. It was the start of a direct confrontation between the executive branch and the highest court in the land. The sudden exit signaled to everyone in Washington that the administration was moving into a state of open defiance against a legal decision that had just dismantled their primary economic policy. Hours later, the president appeared in the White House briefing room for a press conference that was unlike anything seen in recent history. He didn't just express professional disagreement, he launched a personal and public attack on the judiciary. He called the ruling deeply disappointing and told the nation he was ashamed of certain members of the court. The tension was especially high because two of the justices who voted to strike down his tariffs, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, were individuals he had personally chosen and appointed to their lifetime seats. When a reporter directly asked if he regretted his decision to nominate them, Trump didn't hold back. He called their legal decision terrible and went as far as to say their ruling was an embarrassment to their families. This move was seen as a direct attempt to shame the justices for choosing their interpretation of the Constitution over political loyalty to the person who appointed them. However, the president's reaction wasn't limited to angry words at a podium. Behind the scenes, the administration was already working on a way to ignore the spirit of the court's ruling, while technically following the letter of the law. Within just a few hours of being told his current tariffs were illegal, Trump signed a brand new executive order to keep the taxes flowing. To do this, he pivoted to a different legal tool, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This specific law allows a president to impose temporary tariffs to deal with large and serious balance of payments deficits. By switching the legal justification from one law to another, he effectively reset the clock, imposing a new 10% global tariff on the spot. It was a clear message to the Supreme Court: if you strike down one law, I will simply find another one to use. The administration's strategy became even more aggressive when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent took to the airwaves to explain the plan. Speaking on CNBC, Bessent made it clear that the new 10% tariff was just the beginning. He announced that the rate would likely be hiked to 15% within the same week. More importantly, he laid out a timeline showing that by August, the government intended to have tariff rates back to the exact same levels they were at before the Supreme Court ever stepped in. The goal was to ensure that the flow of tax money from imports never actually stopped, despite the highest court in the land saying the original method was unconstitutional. This was a calculated end run around the judicial system, designed to bypass the court's authority as quickly as possible. What we are seeing is a massive legal game of cat and mouse, with the American economy as the stakes. By immediately imposing new tariffs under a different law, the White House is essentially daring the businesses and states that sued them to start the entire legal process over again from scratch. They know that lawsuits take months or years to work through the system, and during that time the government can keep collecting billions of dollars in tariff revenue. This strategy shows that the administration views the Supreme Court's ruling not as a final stop sign, but as a temporary hurdle to be jumped over. For the average American, this means the relief you expected from lower prices after the court ruling might never arrive, as the president is determined to keep these taxes in place by any legal means necessary. The attempt by the White House to bypass the Supreme Court has triggered an immediate and massive legal counterattack across the country. Led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, a coalition of 24 states has already filed a brand new lawsuit to block the Section 122 tariffs. These states are accusing the president of blatantly ignoring the law to continue taxing everyday consumers and struggling small businesses. They argue that this new tariff is simply the old illegal tariff wearing a different mask. This legal battle is no longer just about trade policy. It has become a fight over whether the president can simply ignore a Supreme Court ruling by changing the name of the tax he is collecting. The scale of the money involved in this fight is enough to make every American taxpayer furious. Between the time the original tariffs were implemented and December 2025, the federal government collected over $130 billion from what the court has now labeled an illegal tax. When you add in the interest and the remaining months of collection, the Penn-Wharton budget model estimates the total amount the government might owe back, known as refund exposure, is a staggering $175 billion. It is vital to understand that this isn't just government money. This is money that was taken out of the pockets of American businesses, who then had to raise prices on you. Every time you paid more for a sofa, a new laptop, or a bag of groceries over the last year, you were likely paying for these illegal tariffs. The central question now is whether the people and businesses who paid this money will ever actually see a dime of it back. On March 4th, Senior Judge Richard Eaton of the U.S. Court of International Trade took a major step toward making these refunds a reality. He ruled that every importer of record, the companies that physically paid the tax at the border, is legally entitled to get their money back, because the tax was unconstitutional. He officially ordered Customs and Border Protection (CBP) to stop collecting the illegal duties and to start the paperwork necessary to return the funds. This was a massive win for the over 2,000 companies, including household names like Costco and FedEx, that have already filed lawsuits to recover their cash. Despite this court order, the government is already using every trick in the book to delay the process. Even though they were quick to collect your money, they are being incredibly slow to return it. Customs and Border Protection recently announced that the electronic system needed to process these billions of dollars in refunds won't even be ready for at least 45 days. Furthermore, they are insisting that they will not send out any money automatically. Instead, every single business must file formal, complicated requests for each individual shipment they paid for. This creates a mountain of red tape designed to make it as difficult as possible for smaller businesses to get what they are owed. The most concerning part of this battle is the attitude coming directly from the White House. President Trump has publicly stated that this refund fight could be dragged out in the court system for as long as 5 years. When reporters asked him directly if his administration intended to honor the court-ordered refunds and pay the money back quickly, his answers were vague and dismissive. He essentially suggested that the government has no intention of making the refund process easy or fast. This means that while the courts have said the money belongs to the people, the administration is prepared to sit on that $175 billion for years, using the slow pace of the legal system to keep the cash in the government's hands for as long as possible. While the United States is currently trapped in a cycle of messy legal battles and courtroom drama, our neighbors to the north have taken a completely different path. Canada is currently providing a masterclass in how a country can build economic resilience even when its biggest trading partner becomes unpredictable. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in 2025, has been playing a sophisticated long game since his first day in power. He didn't wait for the US Supreme Court to act. He assumed from the start that the old era of stable, easy trade with America was over. This recent court ruling has completely vindicated his strategy, proving that he was right to treat Canada's dependence on the US as a major national security risk rather than a benefit. To protect Canadian businesses from the blunt weapon of Trump's tariffs, Carney launched a massive $5 billion strategic response fund. This isn't just a simple bailout. It is a highly targeted fund designed to help Canadian companies completely retool their operations. The money is being used to help businesses find new suppliers outside of the US, adopt new technologies to become more competitive, and retrain workers for high-growth sectors. On top of this, he implemented a strict Buy Canadian procurement policy. This policy mandates that for large federal projects, the government must prioritize Canadian suppliers and materials like steel, aluminum, and lumber. Essentially, Carney is using the Canadian government's own massive spending power to create a guaranteed market for Canadian companies, making them less reliant on whether or not an American president decides to slap a tax on their goods tomorrow. Perhaps the most significant move in this strategic pivot is Canada's aggressive expansion into the Asian market. While the US was raising walls, Carney was busy opening doors. He recently signed a historic and pragmatic trade deal with China, which is the world's second-largest economy. Under this agreement, China agreed to drop massive tariffs on Canadian agricultural staples like canola, lobster, crab, and peas. This gives Canadian farmers and fishers immediate access to a market of 1.4 billion people, a move that provides a huge safety net for the very industries that were being crushed by the trade war with the US. By easing tensions with China, Canada has ensured that its most vital exports have a high-volume destination regardless of what happens at the US border. Carney's message to his citizens has been incredibly direct. The comfortable assumptions that Canada could always rely on the US for prosperity are dead. He has argued that being too closely tied to America is now a vulnerability that can be exploited by whoever sits in the White House. To fix this, he has committed the country to an ambitious goal of doubling all non-US exports over the next decade. He is actively building an economic fortress by signing dozens of new trade and security deals across 4 continents. This strategy is designed to make Canada a middle power that can stand on its own feet, choosing trade partners based on stability and mutual benefit, rather than being stuck in a lopsided relationship with a single neighbor. The contrast between the two countries right now is as sharp as it gets. In Washington, the Treasury is scrambling to figure out how to pay back $175 billion in illegal taxes that it has already spent. In Ottawa, the government has been calmly collecting its own retaliatory tariff revenue and using it to fund this massive economic transformation. One leader is watching his entire economic legacy be dismantled by his own hand-picked judges in a chaotic courtroom battle. The other leader is methodically diversifying his country's partnerships so that no single court ruling or executive order from a foreign capital can ever threaten Canada's national survival again. The numbers that mainstream media often gloss over are devastating for the average American household. Before the Supreme Court stepped in, independent analyses from groups like the Tax Foundation and the Joint Economic Committee showed that the average American family was paying roughly $1,300 to $1,700 more per year, specifically because of these tariffs. There is a lot of political rhetoric claiming that foreign countries or companies pay these taxes, but that is simply not how the system works. In reality, the tax is paid by the American company bringing the goods into the country. Because these businesses cannot simply absorb billions of dollars in new costs, they pass every single cent directly on to you. This is why you have seen the price of a basic sofa, a new laptop, and even your weekly groceries climb higher and higher over the last year. Small businesses have been hit the hardest by these hidden costs, with many being pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. Unlike massive corporations, a local furniture store or a small electronics repair shop doesn't have the cash reserves to handle a sudden 10% or 20% tax hike on their inventory. They were forced to make a brutal choice: raise prices so high that their customers stopped buying, or keep prices low and go out of business entirely. This has led to a wave of theft allegations from political leaders. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker have been vocal in calling these illegal tariffs a shakedown of the middle class. In fact, Pritzker went as far as to send a formal invoice to the White House for $8.70 billion. The amount he calculates was stolen from Illinois families through these unconstitutional taxes. Even though 60% of Americans strongly approve of the Supreme Court striking these tariffs down, the administration is not giving up. They are currently searching for every possible legal loophole to keep the money flowing. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already laid out the fallback plan. He signaled that if their current Section 122 inches strategy gets blocked by the courts, they will immediately pivot to other laws like Section 301 inches, which covers unfair trade practices, or Section 232 inches, which covers national security. This means we are likely facing a never-ending cycle of new tariffs, followed by new lawsuits, followed by new court rulings. For the average consumer, this means the relief promised by the Supreme Court might be invisible, because the government is simply replacing one illegal tax with a new one under a different name. To make matters worse, the Supreme Court's ruling was silent on one of the most aggressive parts of the trade war, the suspension of the de minimis exemption. For decades, if you ordered a package from overseas worth less than $800, it came into the country duty-free. Trump suspended this rule last summer, meaning that even small orders from sites like Shein, Temu, or international sellers on Etsy are now hit with full tariffs. Because the court didn't specifically address this, those taxes are still being collected right now. If you order a $50 pair of shoes from abroad, you are still paying a Trump tax on them today, even after the big ruling. The final reality of this situation is that the trade landscape has become an absolute mess that is almost impossible for a regular person to navigate. There are different sets of tariffs for steel, different rules for Chinese goods, and new surcharges being added every few weeks. Currently, the only people truly winning are the high-priced trade attorneys, who are being paid by the hour to sort out this chaos. While the politicians and lawyers argue in Washington, the money is still coming out of your wallet. The hidden costs are no longer hidden. They are a permanent part of the price tag on almost everything you buy, and the fight to get that money back is turning into one of the longest legal battles in American history. You might wonder if this Supreme Court ruling actually matters if the president can just keep finding new laws to use as loopholes. The answer is a resounding yes. For the first time in modern history, the Supreme Court has drawn a hard, permanent line in the sand regarding who actually controls your money. By a 6-3 majority, the court reaffirmed a foundational principle of our democracy. Congress, not the president, holds the power of the purse. The president cannot simply declare a permanent national emergency to bypass the law and tax the entire world. This ruling is a massive victory for the separation of powers because it reminds every branch of government that the president is not a king and cannot unilaterally rewrite the country's trade laws on a whim. The legal reasoning behind this line in the sand is something every American should understand. Justice Neil Gorsuch, in a powerful concurring opinion, invoked what is known as the major questions doctrine. He argued that if Congress intended to give a president the extraordinary power to impose billions of dollars in taxes, they would have said so in crystal clear language. Such a massive power cannot be hidden in the vague or ambiguous text of an old law like the 1977 IIEPA. This ruling doesn't just stop the current administration, it creates a shield that protects you from any future president, Republican or Democrat, who might try to use emergency powers as a backdoor way to raise your taxes without a vote from your elected representatives in Congress. However, while the ruling is a win for the Constitution, the immediate global fallout is creating a state of total economic limbo. Major trade deals with the European Union and India have suddenly hit a brick wall because the legal ground under the United States has shifted. Foreign leaders are now questioning if any deal they sign with this administration will be worth the paper it's printed on. If the underlying legal authority keeps getting struck down, the EU has already paused its trade agreement ratification, and India has deferred talks, waiting to see if the US can actually follow its own laws. This international uncertainty is a hidden tax on American growth, as global partners hesitate to invest or trade with a country that is currently in a state of legal civil war over its own trade policy. Even more concerning is the strain this puts on the government's actual finances. The US Treasury is currently in a desperate position because it has already spent a large portion of that $130 billion in illegally collected tariff money. There is a real and growing fear that the Treasury will have to borrow massive amounts of new money, adding directly to the national debt, just to pay back the $175 billion in refunds it now owes to businesses. This means that as a taxpayer, you might end up paying for this mistake twice, once through the higher prices you already paid at the store, and a second time through the interest on the debt the government has to take out to settle these legal claims. Finally, we have to address the reality of economic theater. Many experts believe the administration's rush to impose new 10% and 15% tariffs under Section 122 isn't about protecting trade at all. Instead, it's a desperate attempt to generate new cash to pay for the old illegal refunds. If this is true, it means the government is essentially taxing you again today just to pay you back for the money they took from you yesterday. This is what happens when economic policy is driven by political performance rather than careful deliberation. The Supreme Court has successfully checked the president's executive power for now, but as new lawsuits are filed and the government scrambles for cash, the battle for your wallet is only getting started.